Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to move from the production and consumption parts of the day. We're going to move on from learning all these exciting things that Bob taught us to getting to enjoy and remember him as a person and the wonderful things he did for all of us and for all the economics profession. My name is John Gruber. I'm the current chairman of the economics department, and on behalf of MIT Economics, I'm pleased to welcome you here. We're going to hear a lot about the different roles that Bob played as advisor, as teacher, as policy advisor, as friend. I want to reflect in 1 minute on Bob's role as institution builder, which we've heard about a little bit already. As we all know, the emergence of MIT as, I'm just going to say it, the best economics department in the world, let's just be frank, is largely by historical accident combined with inspired leadership. And good leadership requires hard work, as which I'm being made painfully aware right now. Bob put in that work. He always put the department and his students first. I saw this firsthand as an undergrad at MIT when we set our schedules around making sure we could take 1406 when Bob Solow taught it. I saw it as a faculty member in the early 1990s, watching Bob hold court at faculty lunch and teach us all about the important issues of the day. And I see it today in how MIT functions and our continuing ability to put students first and to make MIT the wonderful place it is. And I think, the story, I'm sort of amazed at MIT. I think someone mentioned that MIT has just managed to stay the way it's been for so long. And I think the story that I was told about it, which I think reflects it well, is a story of a social psychology experiment which would not be legal today, which is the story of a bunch of monkeys were put in a cage. They put a banana in the corner, and whenever one of the monkeys went for the banana, they sprayed the other monkeys with water. And eventually, the monkeys learned not to let one go for the banana. So whenever one went, they grabbed the monkey and dragged him back. Eventually, they replaced one monkey with a new monkey. And the new monkey, of course, saw the banana and went running for it. The other ones grabbed him and dragged him back. And as you can guess where I'm going, by the end, all the monkeys were new, but none went for the banana. Okay? I view Bob as the first one grabbing someone's arm, but he wouldn't have done it violently. He wouldn't have done it with a kind word and a joke, a deprecating way of saying, you don't get the banana, we're all going to get sprayed. And it's continued. It's continued to this day. It's continued, it's passed on. It starts with people like Peter Diamond, who we'll heard from. One of Bob's most accomplished students, who followed Bob's fundamental lead in being a well-rounded economist, and I believe Peter can correct me, that Peter's taught every single course that we offer except econometrics. Maybe I missed a couple, but he followed Bob's career in being a well-rounded economist. It continues with Jim Perturba. We recently had a fest trip for Jim, which was a wonderful event, consisted of dozens of his students telling story after story about how Jim had shaped and enriched their lives through his dedication to advising. And let me be clear, even though Jim is only half-time at MIT, he still is one of the top 7 advisors on our department of graduate students. It continued about the faculty you heard from today, folks like Daron Acemoglu. Listen, Daron, as his title says, is an institute professor. What that means, he does not have to teach or advise or do anything much. He teaches 3 to 6 courses every year, and he's the #1 advisor in our department. Folks like David Autor, who's carrying on Bob's tradition of eloquently taking the ideas of fundamental economics and presenting to the world, in which can help translate our thinking on how labor markets function, and by also advising an incredible amount of students every year. Now, since others know Bob better, and we'll hear from all of them, I want to instead follow the tradition I think Bob would have liked and tell a joke. And the joke I'm going to tell, some of you have heard, and I apologize for that, but I have to tell it anyway. It's the joke Bob told at his 85th birthday party, which we celebrated at the department. And it's the story of the fox walking through the woods when he sees a delicious rabbit sitting at a typewriter. And licking his lips, the fox walks up to the rabbit and says, hey, what are you doing? And the rabbit says, I'm working on my PhD thesis. And the fox asks what the topic is, and the rabbit says, my thesis is on how rabbits eat foxes. Now, taken aback, the fox says this is preposterous, and he planned to just go ahead and eat the rabbit to prove how wrong he was. And the rabbit said, look, I understand you might disagree, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. Why don't we step into my office, and we can discuss it further. He points to a cave in the back. So the fox says, sure, it's a good place to eat as anywhere else. So the cute little bunny hops ahead, and the fox follows, and they go into the cave. There's loud gnashing and gnawing of teeth, etc., and 5 minutes later, the bunny hops out. Goes back and sits in front of his typewriter. A little while later, a wolf shows up. And the wolf says, hey, little rabbit, what are you working on? The rabbit says, I'm working on my thesis. And the wolf says, what's your thesis about? And the rabbit says, it's about how rabbits eat wolves. And the wolf, similarly taken aback, says, well, that's ridiculous. And the rabbit says, well, would you like to discuss it? Step into my office. They go back to the office, lots of yelling and gnashing of teeth, and out hops the rabbit again. Back to the typewriter. At this point, a squirrel comes up and says, rabbit, I've been watching you all day, and I don't get it. I mean, these incredible predators come up to you, you take them back to the cave, and everything's fine. How do you do it? And the rabbit says, well, maybe you'd like to come back to my office with me and discuss it. The rabbit is a little trepidatious. The squirrel's a little trepidatious, like, I'm curious, I gotta know. So they walk back and they go in the cave, and it's this incredibly dark cave, and as the squirrel's eyes adjust, he's in the back, it's just littered with bones. And behind the bones, pacing back and forth, is this incredible lion pacing back and forth. And the squirrel says to the rabbit, who's that? And the rabbit says, that's my thesis advisor. This is the ultimate distillation of the Solow ethos. That's why I had to tell the joke, because this is a distillation of fiercely defending your students, regardless of their hypotheses, making sure they get out in the world and they're supported, and that is the MIT way, and that is the MIT way that Bob Solow started. So with that, I'd like to go on and introduce an incredible panel of speakers that we have to honor Bob. The first is going to be John Solow, Professor of Emeritus of Economics, University of Iowa. John's done research on a wide variety of topics, including antitrust, but perhaps of most interest to me is sports economics, because I'd like, given his father's longstanding interest in gender equality, I've heard from many people how Bob was such a champion for women in the profession. I'd like John to describe to us how it's possible that Caitlin Clark from University of Iowa, the most famous athlete in America today, will make only $80,000 next year, while the first pick in the NBA draft will make $10 million. So with that, John, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to echo something Dad said. It is, I'm shaky, so we'll see how this goes. As Nobel Prize awards, I could do that, but I'm not going to. On behalf of the Solow family, and I am now the senior member, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for being part of this memorial to my father, Robert Solow. I especially want to thank Jim Paterba, Peter Diamond, John Gruber for organizing it, Shannon May, Julia Martin-Shaw, and Megan Miller for their work behind the scenes to make it happen, all the speakers, and anyone who contributed whom I may have missed. Dad, of course, would have hated this. Don't get me wrong. The chance to spend time with family, friends, former students, colleagues, former students who became colleagues, he would have loved. But he hated being the center of attention. For someone with a model, a residual, a form of neutral technical change, and a paradox named after him, he was from an early age a modest person. For example, some of you know that he won the 1948 David Wells Prize at Harvard. It was for the best doctoral dissertation in economics, which came with publication of the thesis and a check for $500, or nearly $7,000 in today's dollars. By the way, it's still $500. Come on, Harvard, you can do better. What you may not know is that he never cashed the check and never published the thesis. Somebody said he never followed up on that work. He never published the check. He never published the thesis or cashed the check because he didn't think it was his best work. He read it over again and said, I could have done better than that. I learned that he won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2014 when the recipients were announced on a Thursday news show. On our regular Sunday phone call, I asked him how his week went. He said, pretty routine. I said something about hearing him mentioned on the news, and he said, oh, that. I suppose I'll have to go to Washington. By the way, there's another story about the Wells Prize, which he told me shortly before he died. He had received a letter from someone, it may have been an email, I'm not sure. I think it's a letter from someone in Europe accusing him of plagiarizing his doctoral dissertation. And as proof, this person offered a copy of the identical dissertation, but written by a different author. Well, as it turns out, the Wells Prize, then as now, requires that dissertations be submitted under a pseudonym. And Dad had submitted his under the name of a relatively obscure character in some novel. It remains a bit of a mystery how this person had got a hold of a copy of the Wells Prize submission. He was one of the last 1% of the greatest generation. He grew up in a middle-class family in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated from James Madison High School, a school which counts amongst its amazing list of alumni both Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Judge Judy. Oh, and Gary Becker. And it is an amazing list. If you go on Wikipedia and look up the school and then look up the list of multiple professional athletes, judges, Garson Kanan, I think. It's an amazing list of people. He was a good student, but not particularly interested in school until an English teacher who recognized his intelligence got him reading novels and politics. At her insistence, he applied to Harvard as well as Brooklyn College and was accepted with a scholarship, so at age 16, he came to Cambridge. He studied botany at first, thinking he would join the Forest Service, but couldn't handle the drawing that was required. So he took courses in social sciences, anthropology, sociology, psychology, as well as the introductory economics course. But early in his junior year, after concluding that fighting Hitler and the Nazis was more important than taking notes in lecture, he joined the Army. The Army gave enlistees 6 or 8 weeks between signing up and showing up for basic training, and during that time, he met and fell for a Radcliffe girl. By the time the 8 weeks were up, they had already decided to get married if he made it back. He was assigned to the Signal Corps, rising to the rank of sergeant, and spent time in North Africa and mostly in Italy. He and his unit intercepted German radio traffic right up at the battlefield, decoded and translated it, and sent the useful parts to headquarters so that appropriate action might be taken. He later viewed his experience in the Army as one of the most important events in his life. It taught him how much could be accomplished by a small group of people dedicated to a project and working as a team, a lesson that he brought to MIT. He and his girlfriend wrote each other every day. Sadly, those letters are gone. When he returned, they got married. He was discharged from the Army, and they went back to Cambridge to finish college. As somebody mentioned, I think maybe Jim mentioned, Mom was majoring in economics. He asked her, do you like it? And she said she did, so he decided to do the same. But if you think about this, right, a teacher taking one kid in a giant high school in Brooklyn, New York, and saying, you should probably think about Harvard, and then my mother saying, you should probably think about, I like economics, oh, I'll do that too. We wouldn't be here today. Or a very different group of people would be here today. Upon graduation, they discussed what to do next, and she told him he had to go on and get his PhD, and he said, only if you will too. So they both went back to Harvard for their doctorates, and the results of that we talked about earlier this afternoon. Someone asked me after his death whether it had been difficult growing up with someone who devoted so much of his life to his work. In fact, Dad did work-life balance, what we call work-life balance, very well. When we were little, he was responsible for breakfast, and he took us somewhere every Saturday morning to give Mom some relief, watching planes land at Hanscom Field, to the House of Seven Gables in Salem, to a painted Easter egg demonstration at some Boston museum. I remember we were late and missed the show, but as we were getting ready to leave, Dad noticed a woman in the parking lot with a flat tire, which he changed for her, and she turned out to be the speaker and gave us one of these Czech ornate Pysanky painted eggs. Every Sunday, he played chess with our next-door neighbor, a Harvard mathematician named Lynn Loomis. When we were older, the family went skiing almost every winter weekend in Vermont. My parents spent each day skiing together, and Dad only read economics papers in the evenings. And summers on Martha's Vineyard were sacrosanct. Once we arrived, Dad absolutely refused to leave the vineyard until the end of the summer. He got a call during a party one year from Vice President Walter Mondale asking him to come to Washington to discuss something. He declined, but invited Mondale to the vineyard and even offered to take him out on the boat. He and Mom did work on the vineyard, but only in the morning. Afternoons were reserved for sailing on the beach, sailing or the beach, first with us when we were young, and later with a tight-knit group of friends. He was a very well-rounded person. He read all kinds of things, biographies, Greek history, Swedish detective novels. He was an excellent bridge player as well as chess player, a good skier and sailor. He knew all sorts of people, and it was he who introduced us to Bob Dylan, the music, not Dylan himself. And I've grappled with this, writing this how to close. He led a long and amazing life, and there's so many stories to tell. So I'm just going to tell one more. When I was in my last year in graduate school at Stanford, Dad and Mom came out to Palo Alto for 2 weeks. We found them an apartment right down the hall from us in marriage student housing. As part of the deal, Dad gave a short course I would say at the graduate level, on natural resource economics, 2-week course, which I attended. At some point, he was in the middle of explaining the standard Scott-Gordon fishery model, maximum sustainable yield, economic optimal sustainable yield, when a young man raised his hand, stood up, and went off on a rant about the environment, natural resources, and economics, how economics like this and capitalism more generally were destroying the world. Dad listened patiently. After about 5 minutes, the guy ran out of steam and sat down. Dad said calmly, "Well, there's that," and returned to the blackboard. Thank you.
Our next speaker was going to be Marnie Crawford Samuelson. Unfortunately, she got COVID, as those folks are wont to do these days. And fortunately, we have a wonderful film speaker, which is Bill Samuelson.
Hello, everybody. Marnie did all the hard work. She was very close to Bob, even visiting him in Brookhaven. But one thing that the 6 Samuelson kids could agree upon, that he was the favorite of our family friends. We didn't agree on much. We fought and disagreed on about everything. And also, Bobby and Bob were normal people. You couldn't say that about every economic colleague in the MIT department. That's my editorial comment. So Jim and Peter laid down a particular assignment, talk about the enduring friendship between Bob and our father, Paul Samuelson. Marnie enthusiastically took up this project, searched for clues, resurrected memories, connected with coworkers. the folks who sat in the desk outside the offices, to flesh out the portrait. Economists love stories. Some may be exaggerated, but not this one, about Bob and Paul's friendship. Deep, very real, a rare and beautiful thing indeed. Now to the assignment. I'm going to start with an emotional memory. Marnie was 30 and I was 25 when our mother died at Philip's house in MGH. Just moments later, Dad and Marnie went downstairs to find a telephone booth. Dad had a dime. He used it to call Bob Solow. And if you were to rewind the clock 20 years before that and ask, who would have taken the Samuelson clan if the worst were to happen and both our parents had died together suddenly? The answer would be Bob and Bobby Solow, our legal guardians. Imagine you already have 3 lovely children, agreeing to the possibility of raising 6 disagreeable children. Speaking to the Solow children now, we could have complicated, or let's admit it, ruined your childhoods. While putting together these remarks, Marnie found Bob's talk offered at my mother's memorial service back in 1978. This is Bob speaking now. Bobby and I can hardly think about our early days at MIT without thinking about Paul and Marianne. They took us in and made us feel like real people. It must have been about 1951. We were living on White Street in Belmont. I had slipped a disc and it hurt like hell. One evening, Paul and Marianne turned up with a bottle. I wish it was sherry, but it probably wasn't. We started talking. After a while, I began to sit up. After another while, the bottle was gone, and I was floating downstairs. We went to Belmont Center for dinner, probably Lieb's Delicatessen. In Bob's first years at MIT, he was across the hall from PAS. Bob and Dad must have immediately realized they were kindred spirits because they sat that way the rest of their careers. In the MIT News magazine, this is research Marnie did, Peter Dzikis writes, Samuelson and Solow talked so frequently that it influenced room assignments from then on. At the time, George Schultz was in charge of handing out offices. George's view, says Bob, was that one thing was clear. The nice office at the end of the hall, that went to Paul. But the other thing was clear, I would get the office next door. Paul and I were close enough together so either of us could holler and talk through the walls, would go back and forth all day long. The truth is, says Bob, it may have changed my whole life. I guess I had long-run thoughts then to have a career in statistics, econometrics maybe, but when I started talking on a regular basis with Paul, he was so full of ideas and thoughts, it was impossible not to find my interests moving toward mainstream economics. In the way that location of the office and the fact we liked each other so much, it had a huge influence on my whole career. Joan Thompson began working for Bob and PAS in 1968. This is what she says. What I loved was how close they were. They would just wander in at each other's office. They'd go to the blackboard, green board, whatever it was, scratching out stuff. Of course, it was all Greek to me. They'd be deep in thought and talking about this and that. They had a big laugh. The two minds would anticipate what each other were saying. They were that close. It was so special. And of course, it went on right in front of my desk. Kate Crawley arrived later. She recalls the spirit and the suite as welcoming, just the same for everybody. If janitor Paul Pacini came in with tomatoes or some famous person was there, treated exactly the same. Sometimes camera crews were there, things like that. FBI guys hanging out because some bigwig was going to come. Exactly the same. A lot of openness and a lot of happiness. Anybody could walk in, anybody, students, faculty, talk to them. There was just no sense of being any other way. In 1990, Janice Murray took over. In the mornings, she remembers Bob would usually get there before PAS. Your dad would just walk in and go directly to Bob's office, say hello, and talk about anything, something he'd read, and tease him mercilessly. I mean, your father would tease Bob about not being able to dance, not be able to play tennis. So everything that we heard about skiing and everything else was nothing for PAS. He would tease him about having populated parts of Italy with little Solow children, because that's where he was based during the war. And what about weightier matters? According to Janice, Paul loved discussing theories and propositions with other economists, or any other experts for that matter. diabetes, thermodynamics, physics, math, finance, medicine. But when it came to economics, the only person he trusted was Bob. Whenever Bob was offered a position at another university, writes Peter Dzikes, he would stipulate that he would move as long as Samuelson's office moved alongside him. In 1989, PAS wrote an article for the Journal of Economic Perspectives with the title, Robert Solow, An Affectionate Portrait. The article begins, the great Cambridge mathematician G.H. Hardy summed up his scholarly worth with the assertion, I collaborated with Littlewood. When I meet up with St. Peter in heaven, says PAS, I'll say, I collaborated with Bob Solow. Our 40 years together have passed as if but a day. Like Oliver Twist, I look forward to 40 more and can say with Wordsworth, this would be, quote unquote, very heaven. They didn't get 80 years together, but they did share a remarkable 58 years. Bobby Solow wrote a letter she sent to us when PAS died. Memories keep flooding back. I'll tell you a few of my favorite stories. Bob's humor consisted mainly of one-liners, but Paul and I told a lot of anecdotes. We knew each other's stories so well that Paul once suggested we just make up cardboard signs with numbers on them. Number 7, and he replied number 4, I replied number 11. Once I asked Paul a question about some political stuff, and he answered in some detail. Later, I complained to Bob. Paul said exactly what you said. You two have one mind between you. And Bob answered, that's probably so, but you have to admit, it's a pretty good mind. A final story that serves as a complete arc about their lives together at MIT. On what was to be our father's last day in his office, just after he was released from MIT's infirmary, PAS told Janice he wanted to have lunch with Bob. They set up a small table. Janice brought in food, and from a distance, Marnie watched the friends and collaborators sitting across from each other, talking. It's likely they both knew it could or would be the last time they'd be together at MIT. I want to finish up then. Our dad began his portrait of Bob Solow imagining himself meeting St. Peter at the pearly gates and gaining entry by boasting that he collaborated with Bob Solow. Well, I think we can all agree upon the logical sequel. Some years have passed, and when Bob arrives at Heaven's Gates and announces at St. Peter's that he collaborated with Paul Samuelson, of course he's admitted. He joins Bobby, and the two of them are brought to their new house, and lo and behold, their next-door neighbors are Marion and Paul Samuelson. Released from all earthly duties, these old friends are together again, rocking their chairs, telling stories, batting around ideas, enjoying a quip or many, just basking in each other's good company.
We're creating some hard acts to follow here, so I don't envy the people as we go down the list. But next I want to introduce the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Augustine Rayo. I think it's appropriate he's here because Bob, I've gotten to know Augustine well, and Bob would appreciate what an incredibly fierce defender he is of the economics department, an institution where we're not as large as other places. We need champions, and Augustine's been an incredible champion for our department. So let's welcome him to discuss Bob's legacy as well.
Bob was a pillar of the MIT community. As others have mentioned, he played a critical role in building the economics department and building its culture. And he trained scores of outstanding graduate students. He is the stuff of legend at MIT. Our economics department is known for its community culture, and whenever I ask, why do we have this culture? I always get the same answer. It all began with Bob Solow. When he joined the faculty in 1949, he was asked by the department head what salary he was expecting. And the answer he gave was, the lowest salary you offer. And that summarizes the team spirit that marked his 74 years of service as an active and then emeritus faculty at MIT. Others today are better placed to talk about his academic achievements. I'll just say a little bit about his work at MIT. As John said, MIT recognized Bob with an institute professorship, which is the highest honor MIT can bestow on its faculty. And as John said, institute professors have no formal teaching or other responsibilities. But like Duran, Bob continued to teach. He continued to offer his macro class, and he continued to teach PhD students as part of the regular sequence. And he did this for nearly all of the 2 decades that he was institute professor. He was also honored with the MIT Killian Faculty Achievement Award in 1977. So that's an enormous honor, but also a challenge, because you have to give the Killian lecture. So it means you have to give a talk on your cutting-edge work that is understandable to faculty and students across MIT. And you will not be surprised to learn that Bob's Killian lecture was a legendary success. A few years later, he served as a faculty chair of the committee that selected Chuck Vest as MIT's 15th president. And the reality is that Bob was always respected for his wisdom and good judgment, and just like it was sought by the people in the US government, his advice was sought by MIT leaders time and time again. Bob Solow was one of the most remarkable individuals to serve on MIT's faculty. Our community was very fortunate that he heeded our call to move from Harvard to MIT, and that he did not heed the call of the many other universities who tried to steal him away. He contributed greatly to MIT, and he will be deeply, deeply missed.
Thank you, Augustine. It's now my special pleasure to introduce Peter Diamond. Peter, I didn't know Bob well, as I mentioned, but Peter played a lot of the role for me that felt like Bob played for many other faculty, bringing me to MIT, insisting on the first day that I both buy a Volvo and move to Lexington, which I did, instilling for me an incredibly optimistic view of the Red Sox. Remember, this is 1992. Okay, this is the old Red Sox. He said, don't worry, it's going to be okay, and he is eventually right. And I know he watched Celtics games regularly with Bob, and I'm sure Bob is looking down now, pleased with the Celtics victory today, and would be enjoying that. And I also want to say that Peter represents the institution building of MIT. Peter and Jim do, and I think when Bob died and we realized how important it would be to have an event for Bob, I was paralyzed at how we celebrate the life of this giant. And of course, immediately, Peter and Jim came to me and said, we'll take care of it. They took it off my hands. They put together this incredible event. I think we should thank them with a round of applause for this unbelievable program that they put together. So now I'm thrilled to introduce Peter Diamond.
Thank you, John. That almost makes up for your stealing my main line, which is my role is to talk about how Bob created the environment that made this department great for so long. So Those of you who were here for the earlier part heard a number of anecdotes about Bob covering those, and I've got a few anecdotes. And then I'll get into my theory of what I think Bob was thinking. So you're forgiven. I first met Bob in the spring of 1960. I had been admitted to the MIT math department in the PhD program. I had not decided, I knew I wanted to be an academic. When I went to college, I loved it, I never left, end of story. But I didn't know what field I wanted to do it in. And it could have been math, it could have been economics. I thought, no problem, I will go to the math department. I'd already finished half the first year program because that was required as an honors major at Yale as an undergraduate. And so I could take the other two classes and micro and macro and then decide what I wanted to go on in. Well, it turned out complex variables conflicted with both micro and macro. So the issue was what to do about it. And I was meeting with the graduate registration officer in the math department, and he simply said, I'll move you over to the economics department. No paperwork, no, just bing. He probably spoke to Bob on the phone. It was Bob because Bob was the graduate registration officer. Now, just to be clear what that means, it's the person who signs off on the programs of every single student. Now it gets carved up to be a little less work as things get shared, but back then, that was a job so that Bob was in touch with every student. And I went to Bob, and I was figuring I'd do a little bit more than what was behind, because I was taking a serious math course, but Bob wouldn't hear of it. I took the entire economics program, and in addition, one math course. Well, it didn't take me very long to conclude math wasn't it, or maybe to conclude economics was it, or maybe it was just comparative advantage, rather to put it in a technical term. So there I was in the program, having been welcomed by Bob. This happened, just to give you context, in the spring of 1960, a few years ago. The first year, I was looking forward to Bob's required macro class. Back then, classes ran a whole semester. But he went to Washington. There was one time I was in his office. I had come in with a question, and he was on the phone, and he hung up, and he smiled and said, that was Kennedy. So off he went. The following year, he came back. He was just gone 1 year. And I and every single member of the second year class showed up for Bob's first year macro class. We had had it the year before. It was taught by Paul Samuelson, but none of us were going to miss Bob doing this class. The next anecdote comes with a thesis, and we've heard, particularly this afternoon, from a number of thesis supervisees. My thesis was to be 3 unrelated essays, and as Bob explained, for an academic in economics, the research career is primarily writing articles. Therefore, a thesis of writing articles is exactly the right preparation, not some tome which you will never do anything like that ever again. I had been a research assistant at Yale, and I had ideas from then that had perked around, and I had absolutely no problem whipping off 2 quick essays based on what I had worked with my research supervisor, which was Challen Koopmans, not exactly irrelevant. And then suddenly I didn't know what to work on. And a month went by, and I didn't know what to work on. And another month went by, and I didn't know what to work on. No surprise, I was getting more and more nervous as time went on. I didn't know how to find something to work on, but I thought maybe I would become less nervous if I did something you couldn't do if you were nervous. I took up juggling. It helped, but it didn't work. I think it was some point in February I finally went to Bob and I said, I'm stuck. As I recall, he didn't say a single word. He reached over to his bookcase, he pulled out a book, he handed it to me. I took the book, I stood up, I walked out. The book was W.E.G. Salter's 1960 book, Productivity and Technical Change. It analyzed industries with decreasing costs from embodied technical change. And I used his framing, flipped it to be about the economy instead of the industry, and did a two-sector growth model, and I had my thesis done. I did take the rest of the spring up till the day before the deadline. Last fall, in one of my many visits with Bob at Brookhaven, I asked him if he knew what I was going to do with that book when he handed it to me. And he said he knew exactly what I was going to do. So I graduated in 1963, and I spent that summer at the Council of Economic Advisors. Bob arranged that for me. He thought it would be a good education for me. I loved it. I worked with George Perry, who had worked with Bob, so I got some fill-in of what that was like. And then I went to Berkeley, which I loved it. And in my third year in Berkeley, I get a letter from Bob. Would I consider leaving Berkeley? Well, while I loved Berkeley, this was a no-brainer. My immediate interest in the job triggered a letter from Frank Fisher, and here I'm switching to Bob and the department. Frank wrote me saying in the letter that I obviously knew a lot about the department as a student, but he wanted to tell me a little bit about what it was like in the department as a faculty member. And this is what he wrote me. You may wonder how I've come out of this. As I promised John, I'm moving out of my office into a small cubbyhole, so I've been dealing with a lot of old papers and distracted in reading them. Quote, the department is run very largely by those who care to run it, principally by Bob Solow, who exercises the single most powerful influence, although anyone who is interested in getting things done can get them done. It is not my impression that Bob exerts this influence by force, but that he does so because he is interested in the way the department goes and because he is generally right and persuasive. Well, that was certainly my experience. And as I looked back on it preparing for this, I concluded Bob had two principles. The first was that students should be encouraged to interact with many faculty. No one should just be someone's student. And for that to work, the faculty had to be open and encouraging and willing to put in the time to deal with lots more students than one who was doing what he or she was told. Bob has indicated in some of the interviews, which you can find on the internet, that the extent of his interactions with students came at the expense of doing less research. I think he said 20% less, but I couldn't track down the particular one he talked about. But he said it was well worth it. And the second principle was of a shared approach to department decisions. In other words, to limit having a dominant figure in decision-making was his point, And he had some other departments in mind, I'm sure. I'm sure because he said some of them. To encourage wide concern about the department rather than a self-interest focus, he thought friendships and frequent interactions across subfields should be encouraged. At the time, we had daily lunches in the faculty club, which was up here, though the 7th floor didn't exist, it was on the 6th floor. And there was a round table, and we filled it every day of the week, people sitting and talking economics and developing friendships. Of course, Bob was not alone in the drive for a congenial faculty and shared decision-making. Paul was squarely behind both of those principles. And while Bob was the one executing them, he was clearly a two-way go. I want to give 2 examples of Bob in action, one dealing with students, one dealing with faculty. At the time of the bombing of Cambodia, surprise, there was strong student interest, even among our graduate students, in demonstrating against the bombing. So there was a meeting of students and faculty to discuss what to do. Bob proposed that those wanting to demonstrate should begin by cleaning up Central Square, which was quite a mess in those days. And he explained there would be an opportunity, as people said, "What are you doing and why?" to then discuss the bombing with somebody who would be listening to you rather than just speaking to the air. The students liked this idea, and the cleanup happened the next weekend. I was not there, but I learned that Laura D'Andrea, as she then was, got into a heated argument with a Cambridge policeman, and people thought there was a risk of her being arrested. I was told that Bob picked her up and carried her away from the policeman. She was very thin. I didn't see it, and checking it out, neither Bob nor Laura Tyson, as she's known professionally, would either confirm or deny when I asked recently. But I do believe it, and John just nodded his confirmation. My second anecdote is firsthand. At a time in the late 70s, when the department had just promoted 3 newly tenured faculty, Bob was concerned that important department decisions should reflect the up-to-date views of young faculty. So he proposed, and we initiated a rule that when we were considering a tenure appointment, after the committee report, individual faculty at the meeting would respond in reverse order of seniority. With hindsight, there was probably no reason to think that any of Rudy Dornbush, Jerry Hausman, or Paul Joskow would have been inhibited. But the plan was a prime example of Bob's concern. And it was Bob who initiated the practice of retiring at 70, which he did just as mandatory retirement was banned. The academics had a window after they got banned for everyone else. And so he retired at 70, not just as an example, but a little bit of leaning on other people reaching that age. And I think this is very important, as was mentioned by the dean, for what is a small department compared to places where economics is the largest major in the university. And I think this has really done very well for us. So the success for such an extended time in attracting and educating students is a tribute to Bob's role in shaping the workings of the department. Such good students gave me some terrific research assistance and wonderful opportunities of what I will dub learning by teaching, which is a remarkable way of proceeding. And the overall experience encouraged lots of former students to consider coming back. And that has given me, again, a wonderful set of colleagues. That's the end of what I prepared for this, but I wanted to give a different example of Bob, just to wrap up, that has nothing to do with MIT. Our son, Andy, was in either second or third grade. I'm not sure which it was, when, Kate just signaled me third, when the teacher had an interesting project with two goals. One was to get them interested in environmental issues by their analyzing those plastic six-pack rings to hold cans that birds would dive into and get stuck in, and it was a problem. So they did the research about the environmental issue, and then they did the research of how do you do something about it, and explained the role of the government. And she had a connection, I don't know what it was, so that a member of the State House committee that dealt with the environment agreed to hold a hearing at which the students could do a presentation. Andy came home after learning of this and said to us, "We've just been learning about the political process and about the role of lobbyists. I think the class should look for a lobbyist to go with us to the State House." And he looked at me and said, "Do you think Bob Solow would do it?" I said, "Call him." Andy did. Bob did. The entire committee showed up for the hearings. And when Andy came home that evening and we all watched the evening news, Andy was on the evening news. So I think that outside this context is Bob as I knew him.
Thank you so much, Peter, for those warm anecdotes. Next up is going to be Kate Solow, who has, after a long career in the arts, now works with schools and nonprofits focused on program design and evaluation with an emphasis on underserved youth and those with mental health issues. Once again, carrying on the family mission of using arts and social sciences to do good. So, Kate.
I am retired. COVID took care of that. I want to thank everybody here, especially Jim and Peter, and seeing as everybody who spoke here has brought tears to my eyes, there's no question I'm going to cry my way through this, but I'm pretty good at that. I do want to recognize my brother's apt description of how my father would feel about this event, but I would like to add the addendum that my mother would have loved it. My father loved telling stories, and most of his stories are pretty well known. I will say the Infinite MIT Project, I think, dispersed all of his best stories to all of the newspapers that were writing his obituaries. And so I don't want to repeat them. And in thinking about MIT and my father's career, I wanted to write a little bit about what it was like from my perspective as a child, because I grew up in the MIT economics department. I was a mother's helper for Peter Diamond. I believe I'm being followed by Alan Blinder, and he and his wife Madeline came and stayed with us when we were too old for a babysitter, but my brother John couldn't drive, and my parents went on a joint business trip together. And of course, I want to talk about Paul. If my father were here talking about MIT in the early days, it would have sounded completely different. What Peter described about MIT, my father described in a completely different way. It is, I will say, the only time I ever heard my father say that he was proud of his achievement. And what my father would have said was, Paul did most of it. I just followed. And he did say many times that the one thing he was proud of is the way Paul and he turned what he always described as a third-rate economics department into the best of the country. That, and he always gave Paul the credit for it, although he did often add that a big piece of the credit went to the short-sightedness of the Harvard economics department. And the department became my family as well. I always looked up to Paul and admired him, and it did help that from a child's perspective, Paul looked a lot like a teddy bear in human form. And I remember at those when we had dinners at the luncheon in the department, Paul instituted a policy that I really appreciated as I grew older, that you never told ethnic jokes. A joke Paul would tell would say, a pie, the number, went into a bar. And all jokes were told about variables rather than minorities under attack. And one of my clearest memories of Paul was lying awake at night. My parents were out of the house. And thinking, I guess as many children do, what would happen if my parents died in a tragedy? And I guess I had the flip side of your experience. I remember comforting myself by saying, if Mom and Dad died, Paul would make sure that we would all go to college. I was in the 2nd grade. Now, I also had a very unreal experience of what academia was like. I believed that universities were utopias without politics or strife, that decisions were made by consensus, not by votes. And I thought being a department chair was a sort of semi-permanent position, avuncular role, and held by people like Harold Friedman, who Carrie Brown, who near as I can tell, was department chair throughout my entire childhood. And I was once at a cocktail party at Carrie's house. I was probably passing hors d'oeuvres or keeping an eye on his stepchildren. And somebody came up to me and said that my father would never win the Nobel Prize because he didn't work hard enough. I think the implication being he spent too much time with his family, or maybe sailing on Martha's Vineyard. And when I look back, I guess I wanted to echo what my brother said, is that MIT had this miraculous thing where you could have a real work-life balance, and despite what that cocktail party guest said, my father won the prize. But I won the parent lottery. And thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Kate. Our next speaker will be Alan Blinder. Alan, as you know, is one of the most famous macroeconomists in the country. His work with Bob was referenced. But Alan, as you probably also know, is an incredibly influential policy advisor working on both the Council of Economic Advisors and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Indeed, Alan's book, Hard Heads, Soft Hearts, was a great influence on my career in terms of thinking about how you can both care about doing the right thing but bring economic sensibilities to it. And I think no one really endows Bob's ability to bring the policy and the academics together more than Alan. So I'm glad to hear from him today.
Thank you very much. And I'll just echo what everybody has said. It's an honor to honor Bob Solow, and thank you for the honor. Bob and I met in the fall of 1969, so 9 years after Peter. Peter's older than I am. When I arrived at MIT as a new graduate student. The verb met here is really entirely too symmetric. Here I was just starting out in the PhD program, and here he was, a world-famous economist that, along with his colleague Paul Samuelson, was the magnet that was drawing student after student to MIT. I can say sotto voce, I turned down Harvard 3 times. Came here. Those were the 2 reasons. When I arrived, I asked several of the incumbent graduate students what courses I should take other than the obvious. And I got back a simple piece of a simple piece of advice. Take whatever Solow is teaching. So of course I followed that advice. And since Bob was having an intellectual flirtation that year with urban economics, I learned that cities built on a featureless plain should be shaped like cigars. Bob said it was a model of Palo Alto. Oh, sorry. Happens at my age, you lose your place for a second. Only a second, it'll be longer later. A young man in a hurry back then, I did all the coursework and passed generals in a year. I don't know if MIT still does this, but in those days you got a note, probably from the graduate registration officer, I don't remember. It was certainly long before email, it was a note, congratulating you on passing generals and suggesting that if you want to discuss your dissertation, you could go see Professor X. In my case, X equals Solow, which I took to be a very good news in general and an indication that I probably did okay on the exams. So I went to Bob's office. Paul's was across the way, as you all know. And I told him I was interested in writing a dissertation on income distribution. Little did I know at that time that he had written a dissertation at Harvard a generation earlier on income distribution. I can't speak for Bob's day, but in my day, nobody was writing on income distribution, nobody. And I was surprised and pleased that he had done exactly that and won the Wells Prize, as you've heard in the process. And you've also heard already that Bob never published this dissertation on the silly grounds that it wasn't good enough. I was one of the ones that read it in TypeScript. He gave me a copy. I can't remember the literary figures whose name you referred. I was hoping you would give it to me.
Christopher Tietjens from Parade.
Ah, Christopher Tietjens, it said.
Recognized he was a statistician.
Well, thank you for that. I'll try to remember that. And it was good enough, as has been remarked already, and should have been published. Now, speaking of dissertations, when I penned Bob's biography for the new Palgrave years ago, I looked up, with some help from the MIT office here, his list of advisees. And I want to read it to you because it's beyond astounding. So based on completion dates, just going in order, during the years 1966 and 1967 alone, Bob was the supervisor of the dissertations of, in alphabetical order, George Akerlof, Bob Gordon, Bob Hall, Bill Nordhaus, Eitan Shashinsky, Joe Stiglitz, and Marty Weitzman. Wow. It's completely breathtaking. Open the window back to 1956 and forward to 1971, and then you get, now in chronological order, Alan Enthoven, Ron Jones, Ron Finley, Peter Diamond, Ray Fair, Avinash Dixit, Jeremy Siegel, and myself. Move forward a few more years, and you pick up Olivier Blanchard and David Romer. I just want to pose this as a rhetorical question. Has anyone ever, including the great Paul Samuelson, ever advised a list like that. I think the evidence is, I think the answer is self-evident. So while there were no objective metrics for this thing, the man we honor today was probably the greatest economic teacher of all times. These days we call it the GOAT. You probably know that. Great he was, but also gracious, as you've also heard in several presentations already. In the summer of 1971, with my dissertation well in hand, the Solows invited my wife Madeline and I out to their home in Concord for a barbecue. It was putatively a thank you for some house sitting we had done for Andy and Kate and the absentee John. I think he was too old. He wasn't, he didn't need it, to thank us for doing that. But the famous Professor Solow had something else in mind that day. Over a glass of wine on the deck after dinner, he made me an offer that took my breath away, literally. It seems that some months before, Brookings had contracted with Bob and Paul, both, to produce a survey essay on fiscal policy for a volume that received some notice at the time and was actually mentioned in the first session, but has mostly been lost to history by now. As I listened, where are you going with this, Professor Solow, I'm thinking. I learned that Bob had gotten a start on the work, but Paul had lost interest in the project amidst the many other things he was involved in. So Bob wanted a new co-author. Would I take over for Samuelson and finish the essay with him? You can imagine how quickly I said yes. My jaw must have dropped to the floor. There I was, 25 years old, without a publication to my name and about to go to Princeton to start an academic career. And I was being offered a guaranteed joint publication with the world-renowned Robert Solow, making, I didn't realize then, but I realize now, my Solow number 1. My Erdős number is 3. My Solow number is 1, and I'm proud of that. And beyond that, replacing Paul Samuelson, no less, which was totally amazing. As you can imagine, I didn't ask to whether we would call the paper Blinder and Solow or Solow and Blinder. I just said yes. It didn't matter. One offshoot from that paper was the then famous Blinder Solow paper that's already been mentioned twice at this meeting. I have to tell you, when you get to be age 78 and somebody mentions a paper that you wrote when you were 26, that's nice. I didn't expect it. So thank you, Christy and Larry, both. That paper was widely discussed in the ensuing years. It gave my career an important early boost, and I've never forgotten how much Bob's kindness meant to a young man just starting out on his career. And there was more. Brookings had already paid Samuelson and Solow for the work. Or maybe it was a down payment, I don't remember. Which I seem to recall through the haze of memory of many years was $1,500 each. Samuelson was going to pay his share over to me. A few days later, a personal check from Paul Samuelson arrived in the mail. I thought about keeping it for a while, just for the signature and the historic interest. But $1,500 to somebody coming out of graduate school in 1971 was a hell of a lot of money, so I cashed the check. By the way, I'm happy to add, that was the first Blinder Solow collaboration. A few years ago, I was delighted to partner up with John Solow for the 14th edition of the Baumel, Blinder, and now Solow Principles of Economics textbook. I can't speak for him, but it was a very poignant moment for me to renew the Blinder Solow partnership. Now, as everybody knows, and many people have remarked, no tribute to Bob can be complete without examples of his famous sharp wit, and I'm going to give you several after I take a swallow. This is the man who once expressed, and I think it was to me, but it may have been to others also, his attitudes to some, what I wrote in my text, silly ideas, but what Paul Romer called freshwater crazy ideas, then floating at the surface in macro theory, and this is how he described it. If you're sitting on a park bench and someone sits down and tells you he's Napoleon, You don't engage him in the finer points of the Battle of Austerlitz. You just move on. This is true. This is the man who wrote in his famous, at the time, review of Galbraith's New Industrial State that Galbraith's disdain for ordinary consumption goods, quote, reminds one of the Duchess who, upon acquiring a full appreciation of sex, asked the Duke if it were not perhaps too good for the common people. This is the man who obviously let his libido get the better of him when he wrote of Milton Friedman, quote, everything reminds Milton of the money supply. Well, everything reminds me of sex, but I keep it out of the paper. I want to close with a story having nothing to do with sex, but a lot to do with MIT, a lot to do with Bob here at MIT. One day when Bob was serving on the staff, I want to underline that, he was on the staff, not a member of the Council of Economic Advisors at the beginning of the Kennedy administration. Another of the many, many invitations to get Walter Heller to attend a dinner at some foreign embassy came over the phone. Heller wasn't available, so the CEA administrator offered to send Robert Solow instead. What's his rank? The embassy person on the other end of the phone wanted to know. Remember, Bob was just a staff member. Bob gave the following answer. Tell them I'm a full professor at MIT, and there's no rank in the US government that high.
Thank you, Alan. It's amazing this late in the day that we can still hear such amazing anecdotes. I imagine we could go all night with new anecdotes of that type, so thank you so much. Next, we have from Ginger Knox. Ginger's the president of the Manpower Development Research Corporation, which Bob helped found in 1974. Let's be clear, today in economics, we take running randomized trials as a thing that everybody does, thanks largely to the work of my Nobel Prize-winning colleagues Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. But it was very radical in the 1970s when Bob had the idea to help start an organization which would actually evaluate policies by running randomized trials. And so I'm really excited to hear Ginger tell us about that.
Hi. Like everyone else here, I'm really honored to be speaking about Bob, who I so deeply admired. I am the president of MDRC, and we're a social policy research organization that conducts rigorous research and helps public decision makers apply what we're learning to improve policy and practice. And Bob was a founding member of our board of directors in 1974. And from the very beginning, he played a really central role in how the organization developed. And some of the themes I've been hearing about the MIT economics department and the way he developed the culture there also in many ways were true at MDRC as well. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and really it's in no small part due to Bob's steadfast vision that MDRC has become such a trusted research organization over those 50 years. And I'm really here, some of my remarks reflect conversations I've had with two former presidents of MDRC who worked really closely with Bob over those decades, Judy Garone and Gordon Berlin, who's here today with us. So we really agreed together that any tribute to Bob needed to reflect both his contributions to MDRC as an institution and also just the sheer enjoyment of working with him. With the incredible intellect and warmth and wit that he brought to any group he was part of. It's hard to understand why anyone would call economics the dismal science. Because as you heard from Alan's stories and everyone else's, Bob's presence made a conversation anything but dismal. What really strikes me about thinking about his role at MDRC is that he didn't rest on the laurels of knowing that his own scholarship and his mentorship of all these young economists at MIT were fundamentally shaping the field of economics. That would have been enough, but he was also a natural leader, and he didn't stop with that. So in 1974, he agreed to serve on an advisory group that was to design a new initiative called the Supported Work Demonstration. And this was a public-private initiative, demonstration project that would set up 15 social enterprises all over the country that would provide intensive work supports for different groups who had challenges entering the labor market. And this design committee wanted us to learn something about the effectiveness of supported work. Bob insisted this should be done by randomly assigning in each site one group who would get the new services and another group who would continue to get whatever was already available in the community. And by tracking them over time, the researchers would reliably learn whether the new services were more effective than what was already in the community. This was pioneering work, as John said. Social experiments at this scale had really just started. There was a Seattle-Denver income maintenance experiments, had only started 3 years earlier. And supported work was the first one that was embedded in local community organizations, really showing it was possible to do this kind of work in a social service organization in the real world. And in the end, what we found was that the findings were counterintuitive and would have been hard to produce using other methods. So it really vindicated Bob's insistence that random assignment was an important tool to be using. As the demonstration began, the project's funders created MDRC as a nonprofit to operate this demonstration. And the members of that original design committee became MDRC's founding board of directors. And Bob at one point called this a serendipitous turn of events. And to that I say, let's hear it for serendipity, because it engaged Bob with MDRC really for the rest of his life, with many years as chair of our board. And it launched MDRC's tradition of having a wonderful scholarly board of directors who always cared deeply about our mission. Around that same time, in the 70s, Bob and Eli Ginsberg wrote a paper wondering aloud whether social experiments could provide a helpful avenue for incrementally improving social policy. They asked whether this could provide an alternative, perhaps, to the political responses to social crises that tended to overpromise to voters and then underperform relative to what had been promised. In their words, they said, "We do not know if the idea of a frankly experimental public policy can be made politically viable." There were others wondering the same thing at that time, and I don't think it's a stretch to connect those ideas that the two of them talked about 50 years ago to what we now think of as evidence-based policy. Rigorous evidence certainly doesn't substitute for the role of ideology or politics, but it has become one important input into the decision processes at all different levels of government in this country. So we've seen systematic evidence building improve early childhood services, improve graduation rates in high schools and community colleges, improve the ways that high schools connect students to career and college, and inform lots of innovations in public housing, criminal justice reform, and more. When I think about MDRC as an organization, Bob's most important contribution was probably the clarity with which he set a norm of excellence. In his eyes, any work worth doing was worth doing in a way that would make us proud. So from the beginning, Bob really saw that objectivity and rigor were non-negotiable, because being a trusted source of nonpartisan information would be MDRC's unique value in the world. His firm ethic and ours was to go wherever the evidence took us and to insist on results being published, even if the findings were inconvenient to the sponsors of that work. Now, those things are easy to say, but they're much easier to stick to when you have a board of directors who you know has your back. One of the fond memories I and Gordon and others carry with us is that for many years, Bob began each board meeting with a brief overview of how he thought the U.S. economy was doing. So the reason was to set the stage for the rest of the meeting by talking about how current trends might be affecting workers with low wages or other participants in MDRC studies. As you can all imagine, this was no dry lecture. He would deliver his comments with his trademark wit and a sparkle in his eye. And as Gordon Berlin put it recently, he was an incredible, unparalleled communicator, and he described all kinds of developments in the economy in a very clear and practical way. This economic overview felt like we were being handed a sort of a handful of glittering gems, and some of us started to notice that as soon as Bob would start to speak, many of the people in the room would quietly pull out their pens and start jotting down notes. There were some MDRC staff and there were illustrious board members all doing this. So we started to joke that these note takers were really doing two different things with the information. As they were supposed to, they did go back to their offices and start thinking about the implications of the economy for the work that we were doing. But we were also pretty sure that they went home and started adjusting their family's financial strategies to align more with Bob Solow's predictions about the economy. I'll offer just one other closing thought about Bob's legacy. From our earliest days when MDRC was studying a new program or a change in a public system, Bob encouraged us to collect long-term data on people's labor market outcomes because, as he put it, it was important to learn whether the benefits to participants were ephemeral or enduring. And this is surely, I think, where life imitates art. We all like to think that our own impact on the world will be enduring rather than ephemeral. I think Bob Solow was among those lucky enough to know the answer in his own lifetime.
Thank you so much. And now we'll hear from Andy Solow. Andy is the director of the Marine Policy Center and a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And his father has followed his father's tradition of being both a leading researcher and a public intellectual, serving since 2002 as a member of the Science Advisory Panel for the U.S. Council on Ocean Policy. Andrew Solow.
Thank you. So we've heard today a lot about my dad as an economist, as a teacher, as a colleague, as a man whose wit was so rapier-like that, according to Paul Romer, a single quip set Midwestern macroeconomics back 30 years. I'd like to tell you to end things by telling you, though, a little bit about what it was like having him as a father. When he was getting ready to go out to Stanford for a similar event for Ken Arrow, we talked about what he was going to say, and he had the idea to center his remarks around meals that he and my mom had shared with Ken and Selma. I thought that was a great idea, so much so that I'm going to steal it and tell you about some meals that John and Katie and I shared with my dad and my mom. Now, of course, we shared literally thousands of meals with them, and the vast majority of those are lost, at least to my memory. But there are a few that stand out, and for those of you who are waiting for the reception, I'm going to tell you I'm going to talk about 5 of them. The first one I don't actually remember. My dad told me about later, and this would have been in 1959 when I was 4 years old. As you've heard, my mom was also an economist, and she had a particularly keen interest in what you would politely describe as the sociology of the field. So you can imagine the kinds of dinner table conversations that even as young children we would overhear and not understand. And apparently after one of those, I asked my father, "Daddy, is Milton Friedman real?" The next meal, this was a couple years later, and it wasn't just a single meal, it was a series of meals. My dad on the weekends would sometimes make lunch for John and Katie and me, I guess to give my mom a break. And the thing about him that hasn't been brought up today is that his whole life he was worse than useless in the kitchen. And the only thing that he could make, or thought that he could make, was open-faced grilled cheese sandwiches. And this involved laying down some slices of bread and then going to the refrigerator and getting a block of Velveeta. I don't know if they still have Velveeta. It was a bright orange ersatz cheese, which I have since learned did contain real milk. And so the idea was you would cut slices off the end of this block. And my recollection is that you could buy a specialized implement for slicing Velveeta, but we didn't have that. He just used a knife. So he would cut slices of Velveeta off the block, Slices of Velveeta would go on the slices of bread. Slices of bread would go in a frying pan. The frying pan would go on the stove, and he would make us open-faced grilled cheese sandwiches. It was in junior high school that I learned that open-faced grilled cheese sandwiches were not supposed to be black on both sides. The next meal, this is the third one, I think was in 1965. My mom had to go into the hospital for a few days, and my parents told us this is absolutely routine. Don't give it a thought. There's no problem. I believe that Katie went to stay with her friend Irene Walworth, who lived very close by. So it was just John and my dad and me at home. And one day, I think it was a Saturday, we had to do something about dinner. So we went to the local supermarket in Concord, and we bought 3 TV dinners and a Sara Lee Boston cream pie. And when it was time to eat, we cooked the TV dinners. By that time, John and I knew how to do that. And we ate, I remember we ate at the kitchen table. We had a round kitchen table with a white Formica top. When we were done with the TV dinners, my dad went and he got the Sara Lee Boston cream pie. Another thing about my dad, and this was true of my mom too, is that they had an extremely strange relationship with dessert. If we had a round dessert like a pie or a cake, you would be lucky to get a piece that subtended an angle of 10 degrees. But this time, my dad cut the Boston cream pie into thirds. And he gave us each a third. And John and I looked at each other, and we knew this was not a routine hospital visit. But fortunately, everything turned out fine. My mom came home after a few days, and we reverted to the 10-degree rule. All right. The next meal was this is the fourth one, was in, I think, the spring of 1968. We were back in the dining room, and my parents said to us, there's something we want to talk to you about. Your father has a sabbatical coming up in September, and there are 2 possible places to take it. One is in Geneva, and the other was in Oxford. And what we would like to do is talk about this over dinner and answer any questions you might have. And when we're done, we're going to vote to decide where to go. And so that's what we did. We talked about it over dinner. I remember we had questions about where we would go to school, that kind of thing. And when dinner was over, true to their word, we had a vote. And all 3 children voted to go to Geneva. But Oxford turned out to be okay. The last meal was quite a lot later. This was I think in 1983. I was in graduate school at Stanford, and I was living in Menlo Park with Margaret. And my parents came out for a visit, and it was decided, and I don't remember how, that we were going to go up to a little town in Mendocino County called Elk and stay over in a bed and breakfast and come back the next day. So we headed up towards Elk, and just a little bit south of Elk, we stopped in a place called Sea Ranch, where Milton Friedman was living, and we went in and we had a visit with Milton. And it was wonderful. It was just, I can still remember, it was just extremely pleasant. Milton and my dad acted like old friends. And if you'll forgive me a digression, at home, I have a folder of correspondence to and from my dad starting in the late 40s. A lot of it is letters to and from Harold Freeman, and those letters are hilarious, I have to say. There's also several letters about whether they should hire Peter Diamond at MIT. There's some notes from Paul, but I found there I think my niece Annie has this now, a letter dated 1952 from Milton to my dad. And so 52 was the year he finished his thesis, my dad, and he must have sent it out to Milton for comment, and this was his letter back. It was a wonderful letter, very friendly, not very long, very complimentary. He made a few suggestions which I thought were right. But the point is, I didn't realize that their relationship went back quite that far, 1952. I thought that they had met in 1958 at that Center for Advanced Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto. Anyhow, so we had this wonderful visit. I was taking a class at that time, and I can't remember, it was either in the theory of rank tests or the theory of nonparametric statistics. And that week, we had covered the Friedman test, which he had published in, I'm going to say 1937, 38. So I mentioned that to him, and he was tickled shitless. He was like this tall. He was a little guy, but he had a smile, this huge smile, lit up his face, and he was so happy that they were still teaching the Friedman test in 1983. Anyhow, we stayed about 45 minutes, and it was time to head off and go on up to Elk. So we went out and got back into the car and left. And the thing is that the whole time we were there, Milton's fly was open. It's a precious memory. Anyhow, we went on up to Elk, and we checked in at the bed and breakfast, and I'm sure we had dinner that night. I think Margaret professes to remember it, but that's one of the meals that's lost to my memory. I'd just like to close by, again, thanking all of you for coming. It means a lot. And I'd particularly like to thank Lori Glimpsher and Kerry Kilbridge and Beynud Bikdeli, who had to leave, for taking such amazing care of my dad for the last 5 years. It just meant so much to us, and as do all of you. So thank you very much.
Well, that was an outstanding panel, and as I said, I'm sure we could go on, but this has been an incredible event. We're going to wrap up now, and let's one more time thank Peter and Jim and the staff at MIT Economics. It's such a good job to put this together.